Ghost, you like me.
Well,
I understand.
soon.
A disturbing crime unfolded on the outskirts of a small town. Two young women found themselves at the mercy of armed kidnappers. Terrified and helpless, they were forced to obey every command. Their hands trembled with fear. Even the slightest hesitation was met with harsh threats and intimidation. The story begins with Katie and Sloane, two close friends eagerly looking forward to an upcoming trip. To save enough money for their adventure, they planned to spend a month working on a farm. The next morning, their uncle Jason drove them to the bus station, where they were supposed to catch a bus to the farm. Jason was an FBI agent, and before leaving, he repeatedly reminded them to stay alert. If anything ever felt wrong, they were to send him a coded text message. If everything was fine, they would send the word apple. After that, they would switch to different code words each time. Once Jason left, the girls settled in to wait. There was still an hour before the next bus arrived, so they decided to pass the time at a nearby cafe. Not long afterward, two young men approached them. The moment they noticed Katie and Sloane, they seemed immediately interested. Before long, all four were seated at the same table. Katie and Sloane introduced themselves, and the two men claimed to be brothers. The older brother was Jed, while the younger one was Lucas. The pair were charming and talkative, effortlessly keeping the conversation going. Eventually, they offered to give the girls a ride to the farm. At first, Katie wasn't comfortable with the idea, but after some encouragement from Sloane, she finally agreed.
Which one? Right? Fine. Yes!
And just like that, the two friends climbed into the brothers' pickup truck. The drive through the countryside seemed pleasant enough. Everyone laughed and chatted along the way, but things were not going according to plan. Jed deliberately drove past the farm without stopping. The girls were confused, completely unaware that they were heading straight into a nightmare. Eventually, the truck arrived at an isolated house on the outskirts of town. The girls immediately felt uneasy. A short time later, the brothers' mother, Abby, stepped outside. She appeared warm and welcoming, and her friendly demeanor quickly eased their concerns. Abby even invited them inside for tea. But moments after entering the house, Katie received a text from her uncle. Following their safety protocol, she replied with the agreed code word, letting Jason know she was supposedly safe. Abby kindly prepared food for the girls. Then everything changed. The brothers suddenly entered the room and closed every curtain in the house. A powerful sense of dread washed over the girls. Their vision began to blur. In that terrifying moment, they realized they had walked directly into a trap. When Katie and Sloane finally regained consciousness, they found themselves locked inside shipping containers deep in the woods. Heavy chains restrained their hands. Panicked, they screamed for help. Their cries soon attracted Jed. The girls begged him to let them go. Jed simply picked up a shotgun and coldly informed them that if they wanted to stay alive, they would do exactly as they were told. Terrified, Katie and Sloane had no idea what awaited them. As evening approached, a man wearing riding boots arrived at the camp. His name was Boris, the leader of the operation. While examining their belongings, he discovered that the girls were in regular contact with their uncle and even used coded messages to communicate. To avoid suspicion, Boris began replying to Jason's texts while pretending to be one of the girls.
What's going on here?
Later, an unexpected visitor arrived. Sheriff Vince's sudden appearance gave the girls a brief sense of hope. They immediately rushed toward him for protection. Vince drew his weapon and pointed it at the brothers. For a moment, it seemed like help had finally arrived, but it was all an act. Vince was part of the operation. Moments later, he casually pulled a blue pill from his pocket. The girls desperately pleaded with Jed not to leave them alone with Vince, but their pleas were ignored. Jed forced them back into the containers. A few minutes later, Vince emerged wearing a satisfied grin. Katie sat trembling uncontrollably, yet the nightmare was far from over. Not long afterward, Another man entered Sloane's container. Sloane immediately fought back, which only provoked a violent response. Her resistance quickly exhausted the man's patience. Moments later, her anguished cries echoed throughout the container. Hearing the screams, Katie felt a crushing sense of helplessness and despair. A short time later, an unusual sound echoed from deep within the forest. The brothers instantly became tense. They hurried over and placed hoods over the girls' heads. Judging by their reaction, the arriving visitor was clearly someone important. The girls weren't even allowed to see his face. When the hoods were finally removed, they found themselves staring at a man wearing a pig mask. Terrified, they screamed. The masked man pointed directly at Sloane. As she cried out in fear, she was dragged away. Several minutes later, the masked visitor calmly departed. When Katie finally saw Sloane again, she found her sitting alone, sobbing uncontrollably, even without knowing exactly what had happened. The pain on Sloane's face told the whole story. Meanwhile, their uncle Jason had begun noticing inconsistencies in the text messages he was receiving. Growing suspicious, he went to the local police station for help. What he didn't know was that the trafficking ring and members of the local police force were working together. When FBI agent Jason arrived asking questions, Vince showed no sign of concern. Instead, he calmly told Jason to go home and wait. He promised that every available officer would assist in searching the town. But Vince had overlooked one important thing. The girls had already decided to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Katie began carefully gaining the trust of one of the guards. She struck up a conversation, slowly drawing closer, believing he was completely in control. The man lowered his guard. That was exactly what Katie had been waiting for. Without hesitation, she launched her attack. The man struggled violently. Moments later, he collapsed to the ground and stopped moving. After freeing themselves from the chains, the two girls finally escaped. But when Vince returned, they were already gone. What Vince never expected, however, was that the girls hadn't actually left town. Instead, they stayed hidden nearby, waiting for the perfect opportunity to steal a vehicle. While driving out of town, they came across two young girls standing by the roadside. The sight instantly brought back memories of everything they had suffered. Looking at the town exit just ahead, they didn't hesitate for a second. Instead of escaping, they turned the vehicle around and headed straight back into the town that had become their worst nightmare. Their first stop was a local store. There, they gathered supplies for what was about to come. Had they never been kidnapped, they would still have been ordinary girls worrying about school and travel plans. But now, they wanted revenge. After obtaining fuel from the store owner, they prepared to strike back. The store owner could only stare in shock as the two girls drove away. Meanwhile, Boris remained completely unaware of the danger heading his way. He had no idea what was coming. Then suddenly, music began playing inside the house. Boris immediately sensed something was wrong. He grabbed a weapon and rushed to investigate. But it was already too late.
Hey! Those things are awesome.
The girls overpowered him and secured him to the dining table, begging desperately for mercy. Boris claimed he had plenty of money and offered everything he owned in exchange for his life. The girls exchanged a glance and smiled. They decided to play along. According to Boris, the money was hidden inside a toolbox in another room. Katie checked and found it exactly where he said. Inside was a large amount of cash, along with a handgun. At the same time, Jason continued his investigation. After leaving the police station, he visited a local diner to ask questions. The owner told him that his nieces had last been seen getting into a blue pickup truck. Following that lead, Jason went to the vehicle registration office, pretending he needed information after a minor accident involving the truck. He managed to obtain Boris's address. Without wasting a moment, he headed there immediately.
Please.
You promised!
A horrifying scream coming from inside the house caught his attention. Jason kicked open the door and rushed inside. What he found was total chaos and a barely conscious Boris. Before he could question him, The sound of a vehicle starting outside suddenly echoed through the property. Jason hurried outside, by pure coincidence. He passed right by the girls without realizing it. At that moment, the sisters had a far more important target in mind. Under pressure, Boris had revealed the identity of the man who wore the pig mask. Although they had never seen his full face, they would never forget the distinctive cross-shaped tattoo on his arm. Not long afterward, Sloane walked straight into a church. When the pastor turned around, his face filled with disbelief. But once he recognized Sloane, he showed no fear whatsoever. To him, she was still someone he believed he could control. He began threatening her, promising she would suffer all over again. Before he could finish, Katie appeared behind him and knocked him unconscious with a single blow. After subduing him, the girls tied him to a vehicle. Then they drove for miles, dragging him behind it. By the end, his face was barely recognizable. They then drenched him in fuel. Moments later, the pastor was consumed by flames. As the fire blazed behind them, the sisters drove away. Meanwhile, Jason rushed back to the police station. On the way, he received a phone call from his wife. Before he could react, Vince suddenly appeared behind him and aimed a pistol at his head. Jason was taken captive and brought back to Vince's house. Watching the helpless FBI agent struggle, Vince seemed to take pleasure in every second of it. He turned on the radio, letting music fill the room. Not long afterward, he brought in 2 new victims, just as Vince began feeling completely untouchable. Katie and Sloane suddenly appeared behind him. When Vince finally regained consciousness, he found himself tied to a chair. Standing before him were the very girls he had once tormented. Terrified, he immediately began apologizing and begged for mercy. The sisters remembered how they had once turned to him for help, only to be mocked and betrayed. Now, they decided it was his turn. Katie held out both hands and told him to guess which one contained a bullet. Terrified, Vince made a random choice. Then Sloane stepped forward and presented another choice. This time, Vince ended up with 5 matches. Only then did he understand the rules. The bullet would remain in the chamber through 5 pulls of the trigger. That meant the odds were becoming increasingly deadly. Vince pleaded desperately for his life. Katie pulled the trigger once. Nothing happened. Vince exhaled in relief. She pulled it a second time. Still nothing. Then came the third, and the fourth. Again. Nothing. By the 5th attempt, Vince was drenched in sweat. For a brief moment, he believed he might actually survive, but fate had other plans.
So sorry. I will miss.
Afterward, the sisters left the scene. There was only one final target remaining, the brothers' mother, Abby. That evening, after drinking a glass of wine, Abby suddenly lost consciousness. When she woke up, she found herself tied to a chair. Before she could understand what was happening, she looked up and saw her eldest son, Jed, hanging from the ceiling. Sloane picked up a baseball bat, ignoring Abby's desperate screams. She brought it down again and again. Abby watched helplessly as her son suffered, crying and cursing the sisters. She swore that her younger son, Lucas, would make them pay. But when she was pushed into another room, she finally saw the truth. Lucas was already tied to a chair. Because he had not directly harmed them, the sisters offered him a choice. They handed him a baseball bat. If he killed his mother, he would be allowed to leave. Lucas hesitated. Then he fell to his knees, begging for mercy. After dealing with Lucas, the sisters staged the scene. Sloane carefully wiped her fingerprints from the handgun before firing one final shot. Then Abby tried one last bargain. She claimed she had plenty of money and begged for her life. What Abby failed to realize was that even if Sloane was willing to spare her, Katie was not.
But let me go. You promised that you wouldn't kill me.
In the end, Abby's screams echoed through the house. By the time it was over, not a single member of the trafficking ring remained alive. In the final chapter of the story, the sisters staged everything to look like a violent dispute among criminals. With their enemies gone, they took the money and left the country behind. There, they began a brand new life.